going to talk about historicizing. I checked, I would rather say historizing, but I think that's not the official word, so I have to stick to historicizing. It's a bit awkward. It's awkward in German too, but it's something that I've been interested in since my student days because I studied mathematics, and that's the root of my interest in the classification of finite simple groups, and history. And I studied with a person who always started with writing the history of the historiography of the topic. So if you wanted to study the French Revolution, you would first write a book about the historiography of the French Revolution, what this person did in 1989 for the 200th anniversary. So historicizing is very close to my heart, as are the finite simple groups. And in our project, so this is a joint research project that Rebecca and I have embarked on, and well, it might turn out to be kind of an endless journey. we realize that, but it's still a fun journey. And we currently see three aspects that deserve special attention, we think, and that is, well, okay. That's two of them have been touched on. Big mathematics, Lucas mentioned that. In case anyone wants to know what we consider to be big mathematics, we can talk about that later. The other thing is changing perspectives on the nature of proof in mathematics. Rebecca touched on that too, because that is, of course, an essential aspect of this whole classification thing. What is a proof? What could a proof be? And how does the idea of what a proof is change? And then the thing I will talk about today, well, I won't really talk about processes, but just about one process. There's one example that I find extremely fascinating, and that is an oral history project that Joseph Gallian, started around 1980, and he pursued that for 2 years. And I want to go into the history of this project because I think that is kind of illuminating. So as we have seen, around 1980 a consensus emerged in the classification community that the job was done, maybe even around 1976, you can hear the bell toll, etc., etc. And at the same time we have seen that too, a revision project was on its way to produce a more readable treatment that inspires a higher level of confidence and a more readable proof. That's how Michael Aschbacher, one of the key players, put it in 2004. That ties in with the aspect of what a mathematical proof is, of course. Aschbacher and others commented on the fact that the theorem was believed to be true from around 1980, and how the community discussed known or conjectured mistakes or gaps. We've heard about that from Rebecca, which is a topic deserving close historical and philosophical scrutiny, I think. So you could spend, well, 10 scholars could spend the next 10 years working on that, probably. The classification of finite simple groups raised specific questions about the nature of proof and trust in mathematics. And this is not my topic today, but I think that what I'm going to talk about might be related to this, and that is the processes of self-historicization. As of now, today, historical reflections about the history of the classification of finite simple groups have almost exclusively come from the key players. So Aschbacher has touched on that, Gornstein and Solomon. So we have that. And of course, these articles are invaluable for us in our project to try to write history, whatever kind of history of the classification project. And other printed sources, of course, include obituaries and interviews or personal recollections from the time of the classification project, and even two quite readable, if not always reliable, very popular books. But if you want to know more about the classification and are willing to accept that some of the facts are just not correct, Atle could tell you more about that, they are quite good reads, I think. However, work on the history of classification from the perspective of history of mathematics really is scarce. In fact, there's only one paper, I think, dealing with that, and that's Anna Steingart's A Group Theory of Group Theory, and there's a little mistake in her title, because it's not a 1,000-page proof we have, but a 10,000-page proof. So she didn't get that right. But it's a wonderful paper, but it's the only paper we have, basically. As of now, that will change soon, of course. So there is no thorough historical investigation of the classification project and its various contexts. But there were attempts on the way early on to historicize the project, which is a widespread process in the history of science and history of mathematics since the early modern period, or even before that time. For the classification of finite simple groups, we have Solomon and Gorenstein himself instigating this process to historicize, to write a history of the classification. Their history, of course, that is allowed. And this is not really extraordinary, because to put that in context, we have, out of this community, we have other people dealing with the history of finite group theory, or even history of finite simple groups. That's Walter Fate in his talk from 1975. And that's Richard Brauer, whose papers we have, well, the part of the papers that are not with his papers in Harvard, but are interestingly enough with the papers of Walter Fate in Austin, Texas, because the big bunch of Brauer papers is there, and in his lecture notes, you see that he's not really obsessed with the history of group theory, but it's always there, and he has an interesting perspective on that. So, so it is around, really. Still, I think it is remarkable that Joe Gallion, who is a group theorist but was not has never been a player in the finite simple group thing, so he embarked on an oral history project on the history of the classification in 1979. That has, however, never resulted in a publication. So Gallion was inspired by Thomas Kuhn's project, Sources for History of Quantum Physics, and a project conducted by historian of astronomy Spencer Weird, Sources for History of Modern Astrophysics, which ran between 1976 and 79. And both projects, of course, had funding by the National Science Foundation. So Gallion thought, well, let's do a similar thing. Let's do Sources for History of Finite Simple Group Theory. Could make sense. I mean, what he did was wonderful. And it's a pity that the NSF didn't give him any money to do it. And that's something I want to discuss now. Of course, his project was more modest in scale, really. We are not talking about quantum physics, but classification of finite simple groups. And he knew that. And he recognized that the collaborative and outstanding effort of the classification project needed to be documented whilst the main players were still around. Luckily enough, quite a few of them are still around, and Rebecca has taken on the chore or the fun job to do the interviews. And Gallion interviewed 5 of the main players, and transcripts of most of the interviews are available at the Briscoe Center for American History in Austin, Texas. And I think that Gallion's project calls for historical analysis along the lines developed by historian of science Anke Tehesen, who historicized Thomas Kuhn's project and wrote a very readable, if not always reliable, book about that. And there is an English short version published in ISIS in 2020, her ideas about how you should go about historicizing such oral history projects like Kuhn's Sources. Of course, we can do it on a smaller scale. We had 3 peers here, Kuhn and Foreman and Heilbronn, doing the project, and we all know it was a very complex thing. Today, I do not want to discuss the interviews Gallion conducted, but rather concentrate on his attempts to secure funding from the NSF. Gallian has very generously made the relevant documents available to Rebecca, and I'll draw on this material. He got his PhD in mathematics in group theory in Notre Dame in '71 and has been a professor at the University of Minnesota, Duluth, since 1972. And there he organized a conference on finite simple group theory in 1976. That was the conference where the handwriting was on the wall, as Gorenstein said in an interview with Gallian. And as we heard, there was a consensus in the community that the classification had been done around 1979. And Gallian became intrigued by the idea to do this, this interview project. And he submitted a grant to the NSF for $100,000 to do that in 1979. I haven't calculated what that is in current dollars or euros, but it's quite a bit of money, I would say. So he submitted that, and he had secured the support of the AMS, first of its committee to monitor problems in communication, chaired by George Seligman from Yale, and later on of the executive committee and council of the AMS. So the AMS supported that. I'll come back to that later. In the application he submitted, the goals were clearly stated. He says, the classification of finite simple groups will rank as one of the greatest achievements of 20th century mathematics. So November '79, for him it's obvious this job has been done already and we have to write its history. The goal of this 3-year project is to collect and organize source material for the history of this unprecedented undertaking. And I think that's something that at least Rebecca and I agree on. This is kind of unprecedented, and that makes it so interesting. I want to comment that. I think this passage is crucial as it shows that the efforts at self-historicization have to be seen in the context of the need to legitimize the claim that the classification theorem was a valid result, given the fact that the proof was basically unreadable, which generated a certain uneasiness in parts of the mathematics community. I mean, this is somehow related to the things happening about the critical stance on the proof of the four-color theorem. Of course, there was in '76, I think, and well, there are these discussions about what is a mathematical proof. However, producing and telling a success history of the classification, I think, was a key factor in strengthening trust in the classification theorem. And this will be an important issue in our project, but not in my talk now. I go on. The project will be modeled after the one for the history of quantum physics under Thomas Kuhn, and the one for the documentation of the revolution in astrophysics and the history of contemporary cosmology under Spencer Weird. 2 comments. It's obvious that Gallian was well informed about what was going on, and in fact he had discussed the proposal with Spencer Weird, who had agreed to be a project consultant. That's an aside, I was really kind of surprised how the language that we in Germany have been pressed to use in the last 10 years is already all here. Project consultants in history projects, etc., etc. It's been, well, that's been quite interesting to see. The other thing is, I wrote to Spencer Weird, of course, just a year ago, to ask him whether he had any recollection of this, and he doesn't have any recollection. But he remarked, and frankly, modern astrophysics seems exciting to far more people than finite simple groups. So I disagree strongly, but well. But the key problem here may well be that in the 1960s and 1970s, history and philosophy of physics set the paradigm of how to do proper history and philosophy of science. That may be debatable, but I have a strong feeling that this is part of the problem here. So keeping entry to the club was rather restricted in view of limited funding opportunities. So let's see, Gallian goes on to describe the project he will include extensive autobiographical interviews with key participants in the achievement of the classification, biographies, autobiographies, unpublished manuscripts, etc., etc., the impact of a few particular individuals, certain universities, the National Science Foundation, and numerous seminars, conferences, and special programs will be well documented. The conferences, he already has his finger on the importance of the conferences. So one comment here, as Lukas has already suggested, the role of the NSF as well as other private and military funding agencies, such as the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, is crucial to understand how the classification project could really evolve, because there is a lot of money involved here. These many meetings they had, a group theory in Chicago in 1962, in 1960, 61. So there's a lot of money needed to get the people really working together. The archives, so Gallian wants to build archives, will be kept at the University of Minnesota, a microfiche copy, etc., etc. The material will be extensively catalogued, indexed, and cross-referenced, and it will be readily available to scholars, subject only to the restrictions specified by donors, so by the people interviewed or who have given material. So obviously, Gallian had a clear strategy of how to further the historicization of the classification project. And later on in the application, he emphasized, our intention is not to do an official history of the subject, but to collect source material for others to use in the future. And well, we would be so happy if we had that now. We start from, not really from scratch, but. And Gallian stresses that oral history as a method would be central to the project. So I will not go further into the details of this application. It's very detailed and it's very clear and very convincing, I would say. However, it was turned down by the NSF, and I want to discuss some of the reasons. The NSF secured 7 expert opinions, and most agreed that the application was very good, but ambitious. So why didn't he get the money? I find the proposal fascinating, so that is all anonymous, of course. An excellent proposal and very worthy of support. Considerable value to scholars from a number of fields. In fact, the value of this project in the distant future would be inestimable. So that's the expert opinions. However, 2 critical points did come up. The first being that Gallian was not considered to be sufficiently qualified as a historian. Well, that's a fair point, he was a mathematician. The proposer has conscientiously tried to prepare himself to do the project, but he has not yet done refereed work in the field of history, and the inevitable comparison with Kuhn, Halborn, or Foreman is not to the proposer's advantage. And then comes the hint at the limited amount of money available. And it goes on, the PI is too inexperienced in this sort of doing a thing, oral history, and the NSF should not have to pay for his learning how to carry out the project. Final decision of the panel, the principal investigator has not demonstrated his abilities to do historical research. But the real problem, I think, was that the proposed form of oral history was seen extremely critically by the panel. Experience of the sources for history of quantum physics and other similar projects shows that shotgun interviews of the type proposed are not usually useful and are even counterproductive, owing to the errors they create and preserve. This directly fed into the panel decision. The panel strongly endorses the view that the kinds of interviews proposed in this project are not appropriate for sound historical research. Experience has shown that this kind of information by means of shotgun approach is not very useful and very frequently results in serious distortions of the events under study. The panel therefore strongly recommends against support of this kind of research methodology. But this does come as a surprise, given the fact that Spencer Weird was quite well funded and that we have Kuhn's project. This critical stance towards oral history was later reiterated in a letter to Gallian by the Associate Program Director for History and Philosophy of Science, Ronald Overman, and this was really not something that Gallian could have foreseen, I think. However, there were some critical voices after Kuhn's sources had been published. Unfortunately, Terhesen doesn't mention them, but here is Joseph Agassi. Inability to assess its future usefulness, but it's a hastily collected material. So he's very critical about that. Then Erwin Hiebert comes to help and really says, well, this could be very valuable in the future. So there is some kind of debate of what is going on in respect to oral history here, but that is not something that Gallian could really have known, I think. So Overman explained the criticism in his response to a letter by Gallian, and I'll go into that. So the panel has made a statement that the shotgun approach is no longer viewed. So in the past, apparently, it had been viewed as a viable approach, as being a useful tool in the history of science. Oral history, which has been well prepared and which centers on finding answers to a specific set of questions in a narrow range of areas, can have much value, and the HPS program has continued to recommend such projects for support. But then he goes on, it is just this kind of oral history, to collect some material for others to use in the future, that the HPS panel has argued against. And it was for this reason that it played a prominent role in the recommendation to decline the proposal. So no money for Gallian, even though I think he had a strategy in his application, but he made the mistake to say that he just wanted to collect material. Overman then pointed to the limited program budget, but still suggested that Gallian start to build a track record, for example, by publishing in ISIS or Historia Mathematica, to get some more credentials as a historian of mathematics, and then resubmit the application. However, even if he had reapplied, the chances would have been slim, as and that I've only learned quite recently. In 1981, the Reagan administration brought a 50% cut to the HPS program, meaning that the funding was just cut in half. And Margaret Rossiter observed in 1984 that, I quote, aside a brief recovery in the 1970s, the HPS program budget reached its high point in the fiscal year 1966 and has been declining ever. So there we are again. People want to keep this probably in the history of physics community. And that was also the assessment of the AMS. In July 1980, linguist Thomas Mason from the University of Colorado in Boulder wrote to Gallian that, I quote, the newly founded Society for History of Language Science was interested in doing oral history projects. However, Mason had heard from Seligman and Church from the AMS that, I quote, the powers that be at the NSF seem to resent a real scientist, that is an outsider, trying to born in on their domain in the history of science. So, end of quote. At the same time, Gallian had already written to historian of mathematics Thomas Hawkins, who later, of course, published his massive emergence of the theory of Lie groups. And he described the situation and then asked whether Hawkins would be interested in joining me in a new proposal to the NSF. We would, Rebecca and I could have done copy and paste on this in a way for our application. But we only learned about this later. We would be co-principal investigators. It seems to me that the two of us together might make an ideal team. So the one has the expertise in mathematics, the other in history, and the contacts, etc. And then it comes again, such a project, meaning the classification and maybe also the historicization of the classification, is unprecedented in mathematics, and in my opinion, the classification will rank as one of the greatest achievements of mathematics in this century. So here's the chance to do important pioneering work. Hawkins declined the invitation, but gave a lot of advice, and sensible advice, I would say. And nonetheless, Gallian carried on for a while, and he was modestly supported by grants of his home institution and the AMS, who spent $5,000 on this project compared to the 100,000 he had applied for. And we have to keep in mind, of course, that there were costs implied in this. You couldn't do an interview via Zoom. You had to fly over to wherever, so you really had to spend money on doing such an oral history thing. However, the project turned out to be too much of a strain for his time resources. He made this point in August 1981 in the interview he did with Daniel Gorenstein, where the two of them also touched on the failed NSF application. So Gallian, another problem, like had I had that NSF grant, for example, I would have been able to devote huge amounts of time to it. Gorenstein, on the other hand, given sort of the point where you are starting, a year from now or whenever, you might be in a more effective position to get the grant, so to reapply. Oh yeah, I agree with that. That's why I'm going to proceed anyway. Gorenstein, the fact is you do need a certain education, I mean in this whole process. So he really points to the fact that, well, to carry out the project is that he needs a specific experience in historical work and historical methods. And Gallian agreed. He says, I don't disagree with those referees' conclusions in that sense that I'm not a historian. I'm going about it from scratch. And so, on the other hand, somebody's got to do it sometime. Gorenstein, well, I don't know whether anybody has to, but it would be a good thing to do. And this I found very interesting because this seems to indicate that at this point of time, Gorenstein did not really have a strong interest in the history of the classification. Well, someone might do it at some point, but well, it's not really that important. And so he has no commitment to processes of self-historicization, and I think that that changes because, well, there's his 1988 paper, The Classification, A Personal Journey, the Early Years, where he gives an account of how he has seen it. And there are various historically inclined remarks in publication. For example, his publication in the Scientific American, The Enormous Theorem, where he gives his view of how the whole theorem had evolved. So before I conclude, I want to squeeze in a little footnote about the support Gallian secured from the AMS. And I understand that AMS archival material will be put online increasingly in the future, but there are some gaps to be filled still, I think. So he secured support from the Committee to Monitor Problems in Communication that had started. No, there is no, that was the last one. So there is, this committee had started out as an ad hoc committee on information exchange and publication in mathematics. So they really were interested in publication strategies and the math reviews, etc. But they then moved on to be interested in interviewing people in the mathematical community. So it's an interesting committee, and I don't know anything about their history, and there seems to be no archival material. They endorsed Gallien's proposal in 1979, and it's interesting to see that at the same time they had produced a report on oral history. And I'd be very interested in seeing that report, because we know they had this idea that oral history would be a nice thing to have. We have these mathematical people volumes with interviews with important mathematicians. And already in 1978, this committee had discussed, I quote, the prospects for collecting taped interviews from mathematicians who are in a good position to give insight into the development of mathematics in our century, believing that this record would be a valuable resource for historians to come, end of quote. And I think only Bruce Chandler, who later was co-author with Wilhelm Magnus of the history of combinatorial group theory, was available to do some of these interviews, and I don't know whether they have been published or whether they're still around. And also the committee had invited historians experienced in oral history as advisors. For example, Spencer Weird, who has no recollection whatever about this, which is interesting. So to make a long story short, the committee embraced Gallien's proposal because it nicely fit into their own agenda. But so there is a blank. I don't think that. So if anyone knows more about this committee, which had an interesting mission, I'd be glad to learn more about that. So to conclude, one of our key questions in our history project now is about the roles that trust and consensus played in the classification project. We know that Daniel Gorenstein played a fundamental role in assigning tasks. We discussed that earlier today, and also of keeping track of progress. So he really was the one who had the bird's eye view on that. He was respected as a key authority, trusted by the classification community at this time. But we would like to better understand how the classification community came to believe around 1980 or earlier that the end of the proof, or what Gorenstein has called the 30 Years' War of Mathematics, so 1950 to 1980, he's pretty clear about that probably, so that the end of the proof was near, that is that the classification result was widely accepted. And I think that point I try to make is that processes of self-historization play an important role in strengthening belief in the validity of the classification result. But however, as I try to sketch out, self-historicization is not a trivial pursuit, but Gallien made significant first steps in this respect, which will be further contextualized and analyzed over the course of our project. And we are, of course, very, very happy that we have the 5 interviews that he really did, because they're excellent sources on the evolving of the project. So thank you. Yes.
Granted that there was this criticism that Gallien was inexperienced as a historian, but you also mentioned that the reports say that we no longer view oral history as valid. Maybe those aren't the same words, but is there any sense of why this change of heart? Because I have a sense that from the mid-60s well into the 70s, oral history is sort of very popular across the world.
Yes, and I think it's still going strong all over history in a way, in different variations. Well, my feeling really is, but I would need more documentation to really make that point. My feeling really is they did not want this project. And so they make this point that this is not the right kind of oral history. Oral history is fine if you do it in the right way, if you have a good question and you have an experience, if you're an experienced interviewer, then it is okay. But here you don't have any question at all, which is not really true, and you're not experienced, so this cannot really be the right way to do oral history. But he really wanted to do more. He wanted to collect papers, correspondence, etc. So it's, I mean, he stressed that oral history would be an important part, but that's not the whole array of methods or of material he would have wanted to secure. So that's why I think this really is has to do something with a community protecting their own resources, maybe the historians of physics. So David and then Ella and Deborah.
This all brought back my youth, in that I was in New York back then, and a number of people you mentioned I knew, and we had the Vassar conference, which got funded by the NSF, so that was supported by both communities, mathematics as well as history and philosophy of science, which had very little money. This was really kind of clear. And also, it wasn't on the same scale. It's just a one-time conference.
What year was this?
88. But, you know, I was privy to various things that went on. Magnus was one of the people who was asked to write. He told me that he was going to support that and all. Anyway, the part of this, I think, is, you know, limited resources, and then probably the larger thing that's really interesting are disciplinary conflicts that you alluded to. But I think some of these even take place within the community for the history of science, because that board of advisors, you can almost smell it really in the way they react so differently. You know, oh, huge enthusiasm. Well, of course, those are the mathematicians. Then the people in history of science, well, we already had, you know, a bunch of money go to the Kuhn project, and it really is pretty schlocky if you've ever used it. You know, you can see that the quality of those interviews was very, very mixed. And largely because the people interviewing didn't really have a clear agenda or anything. They just kind of asked, what do you remember? You know, it was really, really very, very naive. So a trained historian was bound to say, well, you know, we're paying all this money just to collect garbage. No, I don't think so. So anyway, you can read a lot into that stuff. That's a very wonderful kind of meta discussion of, you know, this type of conflicts in disciplines, but also for resources in that era. You mentioned that Reagan had cut the budget anyway.
It would be, that's the real reason why I wrote to Spencer Weird, because I would have loved to see his NSF application to compare it with Gallien's. Yeah. But while he doesn't have it anymore, it would be in an archive, and the archive doesn't have it.
But is it not known at all whether physics contributed to that? I would have to imagine they contributed hugely to that. That was typically what Overman did, in fact, when he got a proposal which was clearly aimed at physics or mathematics or whatever, he would go to that group and bring in people and get sources out. I'd assumed that was the case.
That I wouldn't know, and I mean, we can discuss that later, because I would like to learn more about him, because it's the first time I came across the name. So,
I have a question and a comment. My question is, what was funded the year Gallian was rejected? What did the...
Okay, I could look into that, yeah.
And the second thing is, I actually echo David's point, the teeny amount of NSF funding for history and philosophy of science, it's like this compared to all the funding for mathematics. So now you have this mathematician applying, and it's very sensitive, so I think this discipline issue. However, I wanted to make the comment that I think this is recorded, so I need to be careful because I know Joe Gallian and uses algebra book. He has had NSF funding since 1977 for the longest running RU in America, and it's very distinguished and celebrated, and very difficult for your student to gain admission to. So, on the one hand, this wasn't funded, but he has a long-standing relationship with the NSF for his RU.
Okay.
Which has been extremely successful and a model for many others. He was way out in front.
Yeah, that's good to know. We know that he got funding for the Duluth conference in '76 by the NSF.
And his RU started in '77 and I think has been funded continuously, and also that maybe there's an article on this in the notices, I think. If it wasn't funded for a year or two, then University of Minnesota at Duluth contributed.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I find it a bit difficult to get an overview of what the NSF really was funding when. There's some reports, but well, perhaps you can give me more guidance, or Michael knows more about that.
There'll be public records for like lists of funded projects.
Yes, that they have, but they, yeah, I think it's not trivial to maneuver these sources. Deborah.
Oh, I was just going to follow up basically what David and Della said about the disciplinary tension that's going on. It's my understanding that currently the NSF explicitly excludes history in its mathematical funding calls. And I'm wondering if that development, I don't know when that happened, or if this kind of tension
Wasn't the proposal to the social sciences panel?
History and Philosophy of Science,
Yeah.
HPS.
Or that was before it was merged into social sciences.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So that wasn't in under math.
Right.
No.
The HPS
No,
was.
it was. But I've seen no allusion to, no hint of anyone saying, well, try it with the mathematicians, try to get funding there. It's, I mean, and Overman in his letter, he really said, well, go and get some credentials and then reapply. So the suggestion really was pretty obvious. And as far as we know, Gallian never reapplied.
It's on my to-do list to ask him about this more specifically. So we're still in touch, and I will ask him specifically about the aftermath of that and why he decided not to reapply. I think that would be interesting. Do we have time? May I add a little comment?
Yes, definitely. We have David is on at 11:15 and it's 11:02. So
Because then, first of all, I would like to thank you for choosing this emphasis, because one of the things that occurred to me when we started working on this is that this is a chance to celebrate underappreciated contributions. And I think that Joe Gallian is really one of these people who contributed. The Duluth conference was a major milestone in this whole thing, but often he would not be mentioned, and his contributions would not be mentioned. The same with this oral history endeavor that he had. And when I talked to him, I got the feeling that he was really one of these people who were not in the middle of things, but they saw that something big was happening. And therefore, I'm grateful to you that you celebrated this a little bit here in your talk, and I would like to take the opportunity and just say that I think this is an important aspect of our work. We can maybe uncover contributions by people who are usually forgotten or that are often forgotten, because everyone just talks about the big names, and there are these narratives that we would try to also question a little bit. And building on that, thank you for the lively discussions that we have about this project. So many people come and talk to us and ask questions, and this is really fruitful because it gives us more ideas where to develop this in the future. And as we have seen, again, thank you for making this point so strong, it's just an enormous amount of work. And maybe you can almost see my heart bleeding if I think about all the sources that we could have if Joe Gallian had been successful with this. Just imagine. Thank you, Volker. Thank you.
thank you.